Jordan and Micah Lande, both are assistant professors at the Arizona State University, which I'm told is the largest university in the United States. But they have a number of making programs that these guys have put together. Come on out. One of the things that they both started to do, was it last year or 2 years ago, is studying the Maker Faire audience and its makers 2 years ago, and I think they'll be reporting on that today for you. So let's welcome Micah and Shawn. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale.
All right, thank you. So we're glad to be here. We're going to talk about the educational pathways of makers. We'll briefly talk about who we are, how we're trying to understand from the people who call themselves makers. We're building a maker theory, and then we'll talk about making and engineering and what those mean, and ask you to do a quick exercise. So make sure that you have a pen or pencil in hand. We'll talk about the research design of what we've done to try to understand makers, and then some seeds for discussion, and we'd be happy to take what we're reporting on today and what we could do next, and talk to you further if that's something that you're interested in.
So this is Micah Lande. He's an assistant professor at Arizona State University in engineering, and he is a maker. He's also a Stanford-trained mechanical engineer. He's into design thinking and was part of the Stanford's D School while he was there. He was also involved with a study called the Academic Pathways Study, which looked at the pathways of students all through their engineering education, and that's part of what fed into our work, looking at the pathways of makers. He was also involved with a group, or with a program called I-Core for Learning. So if you're familiar with Lean Launchpad, I-Core basically takes Lean Launchpad and teaches educators as well as entrepreneurs, or potential entrepreneurs, how to use Lean Launchpad to make their ideas happen and make them sustainable and scalable. And then he also is involved with the MakerCon and set up the first Arizona MakerCon site.
And so Shawn Jordan is also an assistant professor at Arizona State University. He's a maker. He's a Purdue-trained electrical engineer. He's done Rube Goldberg devices competitively. He worked on Design Squad. He's also worked on the Innovation Core for Learning. And he has a career grant from National Science Foundation to study the overlap of engineering design and the Navajo. And so we're right in the middle of being engineers and makers, and then also being professors and researchers. And so based on our own experiences as makers and our interests in how we can make the engineering education enterprise and higher education better and more relevant for our students, the trying to marry all of these perspectives drove us towards looking at makers. So as you all know, there are those that call themselves makers, participate in maker fairs. Here's a picture from Maker Faire from last year here at New York Hall of Science. And so our starting point is, well, what is a maker?
And so some of the things that we've found out so far in interviewing a number of makers, both adult and kids, is that the making community is that of additive innovation. Now, what does that mean? Makers actively search out. They have ideas. They actively search out what others have done in the same space. They take those ideas, they improve on them, and then they share them back in the community. Now, we gave a talk to a group that included some members or some representatives from the Patent and Trademark Office recently, and they raised their eyebrows at this, because if you look and think about the way the engineering culture is, it's more of closed innovation, where you're working in your company and you need to protect your IP from others. So that is an interesting difference that we've identified. Also, there's that of playful invention, and this gets back to the idea, particularly for those of you in K-12. Our kids are born knowing how to play, and makers continue to exhibit that in their making. But as we look toward engineering, the engineering community, is the playfulness still there in the way engineering exists? So that's another interesting difference between the two communities. We also have identified a really strong sharing ethos, and combined with the additive innovation, the idea that makers don't just want to most makers don't want to just sit in their garages and do their own thing. They want to share it back with the community. They want to go out and get feedback. They want to present. I mean, that's the whole purpose of these events, is for them to share what they're doing. And that's something that is very special because it creates a community through sharing. One of the things that we find really interesting in the discussion here is there are multiple groups of people who have different philosophies about making, and some believe that a maker community is built from technology. We question through the sharing ethos, is it also through the actual people and not just the technology? And part of what we're working on now is developing a maker learning ecology, which is basically the set of factors that works together in the ecosystem that makers are learning within. And that's part of our ongoing research. Now, one example of parallel pathways. So we've seen a number of situations where makers come from a variety of different pathways. So they could be engineers, they could be scientists, they could be artists, but they're doing the same types of things. And an example of this is toy makers. We interviewed, and there may be some of you in this room actually who we've interviewed who are coming from an engineering perspective, and they may be doing small interactives, as well as from the science world. Large interactive toys. We've got artists, engineers, and then young audience. It could be an artist, scientist, or engineer. And these are just from random sampling, which really makes an interesting statement, because if you look at the technical artifacts of many of these toys, some might look at them and say, oh, well, that's engineering. But from a pathways perspective, people are coming from many different paths into that same technical output.
And so a lot of what we found is that there's conceptions of what making is and what engineering is, and it differs from what your own experiences are or your community is. And so the interesting thing is we've been exploring through interviewing makers and asking them about what they make, what they're learning when they make, who they make it with, their educational pathways through or around informal or formal engineering education, is how making and engineering overlap. And so in that interest, we have a quick activity for you to do. On the aisle on, I guess, that stage left, there are some index cards, and if you could be kind enough, if you're grab the cards from that and pass it down the aisle, so everyone, distribute them so everyone has one.
You're about to participate in research.
Yeah, and so what we'd like you to do is write the word making, and then underneath that, write a word or a phrase that defines that term for you. So on an index card, write making, and then a word or a phrase that defines that for you. All right, so it looks like most of you have done that. So what we'd like you to do is turn to the person closest to you and share with them what you wrote down and what they wrote down. Is it the same? Is it different? So spend a minute doing that to fill the dead. Started at 3:38.
Okay.
Not enough time. All right, let me interrupt you. What are some words or phrases like that came up? I invite you to just shout them out. What are build, create, catalyst, invent, craft, community, life, lives. Okay, solution. All right. So let me ask you then to turn the card over, and now let's do another similar activity to define the word engineering. So write the word engineering and write a word or a phrase that defines that term for you.
Don't hurt yourself.
So as you do that, do the same thing you just did. Turn to the person next to you and compare notes. How did you define engineering? Did you use similar words, different words? Were they different words or the same words as defining making?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As artifacts, they have stories behind. Okay. All right. Let me interrupt you again. And really, for us, this is an interesting jumping off point for lots of conversations, and will be available outside afterwards if you're interested and around the rest of the day and tomorrow. So what are some words or phrases that came associated with engineering? Technical? Discipline? Straight? Problem solving? Design? Analysis? Mm-hmm. Elegance. When we started, I heard "ouch" as well. So this is right. So this is something that we've done in a number of audiences. And so last year at the Bay Area Maker Faire, we did this as to what is making to you, what is engineering to you, and so you consider this a little bit. Definitions of making or words that were used in that appear here on this word cloud, and so the words that are larger had a larger frequency in responses. So you could see creating, fun, something, making, and so then we did this with engineering. So making stuff, job, fun, math, thing, and so it's not too dissimilar from what I heard you shouting out your responses and your answers. But there is something different about making, and there is something different about engineering.
Did you find anything different about the fact that there was like a 20% increase in words that describe engineering than making?
So yeah, so there's more breadth. And so yes, that's something that we... Yeah, and so we've written up a little bit of this analysis, and we can talk about it a little bit more after this presentation. And so just thinking about how we could, what our impact is and what we want, what our context is, we're trying to think about what it means to infuse making into engineering curriculum. So there are accreditation bodies that define what it is that an engineering program should deliver and what the engineer of the future is like. And some of that is practical ingenuity, creativity, lifelong learning, things that come from a making experience that may or may not be present in an engineering curriculum.
And then in addition, we're also looking at things like workforce development and broadening engineering pathways. This is something I'm particularly interested in my career research, where I'm working with the Navajo to look at how Navajo culture and engineering design and making all blend together. And so that's been really interesting from a broadening pathways perspective. And then also informed educational efforts. So how can we inform formal education with what we learn from making? Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the research design and to give you an idea of what kinds of methods we're using to do this research. And this is all based on 2 National Science Foundation grants. The first one is called Should Makers Be the Engineers of the Future? And the sequel is called Might Young Makers Be the Engineers of the Future? Now that parallelism is intentional because the results from the adult maker study are extending on to inform what we're learning in the young maker study, and actually we're here at this maker fair to continue interviewing young makers as we ramp down the adult maker study. One of the interesting things, we did our first young maker interviews at the Bay Area Maker Fair back in May, and found that just in side conversations with the parents of these young makers, that there is a whole fascinating story there about how they are supporting their kids to become lifelong learners and make. And so we're actually extending the scope of our study a little bit to begin interviewing parents as well, and we'll be reporting on those results hopefully within a year or so. Now, our 2 main research questions for both of these studies are, first of all, what are the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that makers possess that could be related to engineering? And then second of all, we want to know, how do the pathways of makers intersect with engineering? And this has several purposes. So basically, the knowledge, skills, and attitudes question is about what everyone is concerned about. Well, what can we assess? And what are makers learning from these informal activities? And so that's really what we're trying, from a maker's perspective, we're trying to understand what they think they're learning, so that will inform future research in the assessment vein. And then second, the pathways question. A lot of people, again, look at makers and say, oh, particularly young makers, and say, oh, well, they're playing with Arduinos and Raspberry Pis, they're going to become engineers. But we're still in early data collection for that, but from your informal conversations with a lot of young makers, that may or may not be the case. And that's something that we want to understand in a deeper manner. Now, our research design, the takeaway from this is that there are rigorous educational research methods that go behind this, and philosophical foundations, basically focused on constructivism and also some research or some methodological methods that go along with that. So far, we've been interviewing makers primarily at the Bay Area Maker Fair as well as the World Maker Fair in New York over the past few years, and then we've also interviewed some makers at ASU. And to date, we have interviewed 42 adult makers, 17 females, 25 males, and then we've interviewed about 12 kids, and we're hoping to double that during this Maker Fair. Now, our data collection methods are twofold. First of all, we do what are known as artifact elicitation interviews, which to many makers basically seems like a TV interview, where we go and we talk to them at the Maker Fair. We've got a camera, and we ask them a set of questions during those interviews. And those questions might be things like, well, what skills did you have to learn to build this? And how does your passion for whatever it is that you made relate to what you're doing in school or what you're doing in your job? And the idea of doing that with the artifact there is that they will talk about, they'll give those answers in the context of whatever it is they made and point to that and make references, so they'll talk more. And then we're also doing follow-up critical incident interviews. These are longer interviews outside of the Maker Faire environment where we're digging into the pathways questions in particular. So trying to understand what they studied in college, how, or if they went to college, what pathways they had through that, whether they even considered engineering, if they didn't, why, if they did, why not, and pursuing that career in engineering.
And so we can tell you more details about our study, and we reported on our findings at the beginning. Some of the seeds for discussion is, how does making compare to engineering? How might making be brought into the classroom? So project and product-based learning. How might makers earn credit for making? And how might we make engineering an appealing pathway for young makers? So thank you for your time.
Thank you.